Thank you, Ben. And I wanted to mention that I downloaded this presentation and did a test drive with my own students. And I would agree with Ben that so far I'm seeing good results. I have more clarity now that we've talked to people who scored these exams. And so I think my kids are more clear on how to approach each of these questions. So far, at least, this seems to be working. The first question, as you know, is the concept application question. And these questions will always have a similar format. Kids will be given some kind of news story that has implications for government and politics, and then they need to respond to the scenario with information that they've learned in the class. And the A, B, and C parts are always going to be pretty similar to one another. In this case, the question is about the Alliance Defending Freedom and the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits religious leaders from certain kinds of political activity, endorsing particular candidates, contributing to political campaigns. And so kids had to take what they knew and apply it to this scenario. And so unless you covered this specifically in your class, and you probably didn't, I know I didn't, the key is for kids to have lots of practice with other kinds of scenarios so that they can take those skills and transfer them regardless of what they might get on the exam. So here are some tips. Most of you probably do some kind of current events presentations. I know sometimes teachers take this on themselves and talk about what's in the news, and then more importantly take the next step and apply the concepts they've learned to what's going on in the news. I am fundamentally lazy, and so what I do is I have kids sign up we're on block schedule, so whatever the first day of the week is, they present current events. And in my class, they do them according to the themes of the course, like liberty and order, for example, or constitutionalism. They have to find a story that represents each of those topics and tie it into those big units that we study. I also have them include a graph or chart, funny story about that in a minute, and a political cartoon as well as a quotation, because those are all things that might appear on the AP exam. And I don't want to try to outguess what's going to be on the exam. I think that's an exercise in futility. I think this exam is more about transference and skills. And so every week we look at what kids have put together and try to analyze these different components. My funny story is that the kids put up a graph about the #1 issue facing Americans, and the overriding response was healthcare. And then I looked at who created the graph, and it was the Kaiser Foundation. So it gave us an opportunity to talk about who's doing the polling and why they might be doing it and that sort of thing. So we kind of stumbled into an extra lesson there. So another way to do this, in addition to current events, is just find something in the news and use it as a bell ringer, and then pull something from the news and use it in FRQs, and also have them practice it in multiple choice questions. The more they can tackle these new ideas, the better prepared they'll be for the exam. And then, of course, as AP teachers, we always know that kids need to know the basic task verbs, the difference between identifying something, describing something, or an explanation that requires a connection or a because statement. And I'll show you a couple of examples here in a minute. Okay. This was what one of the AP leadership readers told us, and I think this is something I have to remind my students of all the time. You know, kids read the scenario and then they answer the question, even though the question says, in the context of the scenario, do this or that, they forget to tie it back to the scenario. And so they have to be really clear that they understand what they've read, and they may understand it beautifully, but unless they express that to the reader has no way of knowing whether the kid fully understands the story. And so they need to go back to that story in their response. I always say AP means answer the prompt. So a description is different from an explanation. I actually got this from a kid today. I asked them to explain how the Constitution supports the theory of elitism, and what I got was a good description of what elitism is. The kid was missing that because statement, and I'll show you what that looks like in the context of this question in a minute. Okay, part A is a description of an action Congress could take. So let's take a look at the example. Congress could pass a law that allowed religious leaders to speak freely about political candidates. I like this answer because it's very specific. A lot of kids will just say something like, Congress could pass a law. That doesn't put it in the context of the scenario. Technically, it's a correct answer, but it's not enough of a description for a reader to understand that the kid fully gets the scenario. So I'm encouraging my kids right now, and I have some who are still really struggling with this, to take that one step further. If Congress is going to pass a law or the executive is going to take an action, to be really clear about what that law or action is. It's an explanation, and in this case, how partisanship in Congress can prevent Congress from passing the law described above. So here's an example. Partisan division in Congress could prevent a law from being passed because Democrats and Republicans would not agree on it. And I would go further and say, and therefore would not be able to reach a majority and pass the law or pass both houses. The key to this explanation is that because statement. I know there are other ways of doing explanations, but because we're dealing with teenagers and they like clear rules, I just tell them explain means because. Every explanation has to have a because statement in it, and that forces them to make that additional link. Part C is another explanation. In this case, why the Alliance Defending Freedom might argue its constitutional rights are limited by the Johnson Amendment. So here's an example. They would argue that the amendment limits its rights because the First Amendment protects political speech. And again, you might want to point out to kids that there is a lot in here. We're not just talking about the First Amendment, but the specific protection in the First Amendment. If a kid just said because of the First Amendment, I don't know what they're talking about. Maybe they are talking about the Establishment Clause, which isn't relevant here, even though it involves religion. So again, just getting kids to close that loop and tie things down, and those because statements really help.